everyone, and welcome to the Death by Adaptation podcast, a bi-weekly book club where we choose one classic book and compare and contrast it against its cinematic adaptations. I'm your host, Nicolò Grasso, and I'm joined, as always, by the great Ewan Gleadow. How are you doing, Ewan?
I'm good. I almost waved at the camera and then remembered we're on a podcast, so that's a good start. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing all right. It's been a long week, lots of things happening in the world, at work, private lives. Like it's a mess, and so I'm happy we can actually find the time to spend an hour, 90 minutes, all of us together. And I want to introduce as well our lovely guest for the episode, Jack Keating, one of my favorite letterbox reviewers. So Jack, how are you doing?
That too kind. I appreciate that. I'm great. How are you?
Yeah. I'm so happy we're doing this. It's an episode because when we were planning everything, I thought about it. I was like, you know what? We're gonna be talking about Inherent Vice soon enough. I know there's just one person that has to be on this podcast. There's one fan that has to be on it. I was like, Jack, can you make it? And here we are right now. But
Here
before
we
we continue, I see you people. You're listening on Apple Podcasts. You're listening on Spotify. I've seen the stats. You're out there. Just consider leaving us a 5-star review on there, because it means a lot to us, and it can help us get more lovely guests and just more listeners, because we love doing this show, and we'd love to have more of you finding us and discovering us. So yes, if you can, leave a 5-star review on whatever you're listening to. And now, let's begin talking about Inherent Vice.
How about your ex-girlfriend? Shasta, Faye, Hepworth.
Shasta Faye Hepworth.
She is a known intimate of Glenn's employer, Mickey Wolferman. But do you think that Glenn and Shasta were... Fucking?
Fucking?
Is that why you killed him? How does it make you feel? And here you are still carrying the torch, and there she is in the company of all those Nazi lowlifes.
Doing that, Biffle? You give me a hard on.
Tough little wop monkey, as my friend Fatso Judson always says.
The book of Inherent Vice has become legendary since it came out in 2009 by Thomas Pynchon, a writer that I honestly was not super familiar with before jumping in, reading the novel. Everyone was like, yes, Thomas Pynchon is hard to describe. He is an insane writer who just goes full into this very psychedelic stream of consciousness, but also very calculated type of writing. The way he narrates everything in Inherent Vice, but also I've read a bit of his other books, including I forgot the name, the book Gravity's Rainbow. Also, some of Gravity's Rainbow. I really like his style, and Inherent Vice lends itself beautifully to his writing, because this is a story set in 1970 LA, and it's a neo-noir of sorts, where you're following a detective who is hired by a girl from his past to go find a missing person who's involved in capital estates and money laundering schemes and mafia. And our protagonist is Doc Sportello, and he is a hippie. He is high out of his mind constantly. And so the book has this very, again, stream of consciousness style of writing, where there are scenes that go on forever, and there are moments where it's just cutting from location to location, from character to character, constantly introducing new people, and you're just lost. And that feeling is bewildering, it's scary, but also so exciting and refreshing. And the way he creates this neo-noir mystery that's not really about the mystery is a magic in and of itself. And I'm really looking forward to talking about what Inherent Vice is about. So, Jack, what are your thoughts on the novel of Inherent Vice?
Yeah. So I'm gonna begin this with a little story. Maybe like 3 years ago, I went to my local bookstore and I picked up Gravity's Rainbow, and I'm like, this is, everyone talks about this as being like one of the great, like the great American novel. And I got through the first like chapter, and I'm like, I don't think I'm ready for this yet. This is this is a lot. There's a lot going on here, and I definitely think, and this reading this has provoked me to go back and give it another
Mm.
chance. And I know I'm gonna love it. Like how can I not? But I have to say, like, the book is, in comparison to the movie, it's so different for me, at least, as a fan of the movie. But the book is incredible. I was so impressed with how lucid it felt. It felt very, you mentioned stream, in and out of consciousness. You're not really too sure what's going on really with the
Mm.
book. It's, if I were to like come up with something to describe it, it's like a vibe, you hear that word so often, but like it's vibes. It's chapter upon chapter of just observations and vibes and aesthetic in a book. And I think it's just it's incredible. I was a huge fan of it, and although Pynchon, from what I've heard, he's like hard to like get into, just because he's
Mm.
like he's just like one of, it's like dense. There's a lot to him, but like I feel like this is like a really accessible, quote unquote accessible, like book to read by him if you're not that like familiar with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only imagine like what the other books are like. One thing I noticed for sure, just kind of a brief note, this is not, I found that it wasn't entirely about the relationship between our main character Doc and Shasta Fay, while the movie
Mm-hmm.
enforces that, that's like the main idea, and we'll get to that when we talk about the movie. Rather, I think Pynchon's goal is just kind of portray a decaying, movement, that the counterculture movement, as it progresses into the 70s, where, as history tells us, we know it really won't last and stuff. And it's kind of melancholic with its writing, especially with the last chapter where Doc's just kind of reevaluating everything, and
Mm-hmm.
kind of just wondering what it all means, just like how we are, as soon as we finish the book.
Truly, truly,
Yeah.
beautifully put. How about you, Ewan? What are your thoughts on this book?
How am I meant to go after that? That was beautifully put and well researched. And here's me. I've stumbled into this after being at the cinema, and it was good. It was all right. Yeah. It's one of those books that I kind of, I get why people really love it. I do. It just not my cup of tea, essentially. It was the same for, I read this at the same time, well, not the same time. I can't read two books at once, but like just after I'd read the Electric Kool-Aid Test from Tom Wolfe, and it was that and Inherent Vice that sort of both, obviously they're not the same, but their implications of drug use, and the story that it follows is very loose and very free. It's, I don't know, it just didn't click with me. I think it might be because a while ago I read the Joan Didion article on the hippie culture, and I kind of not disagree with the hippie movement. I find it really interesting, but I don't really think it was the freewheeling, loving time that it's sort of portrayed as in a lot of popular media.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of crack and a lot of horrible times. But I do think that Inherent Vice, and especially Pynchon's writing, they do get to grips with that. They do get to grips with the sort of the darkest horns of it, the genuine horror stories of cartel dealings and mobs and deals gone wrong and money laundering, because it is exciting, and it's like you said, Jackie, very difficult to get into. But Inherent Vice is probably the place to start. There's a lot of really grand and explorative ideas in here, and
Mm.
there's a lot of culture to extract from what is a very tumultuous time for the 1960s. I mean, the hippie movement was just an explosion of music and art and creativity and drug culture, and it's always going to be underlined by the historical notions of it, the Vietnam War, and there's so much to unpack that it's very difficult to find a text that can actually do it. I don't know why, but I always think of Almost Famous when I think of stuff that
Hmm.
sort of takes apart the 60s, but mainly because it knew to just focus in on one thing. And I always find that when it's a topic as broad as that is trying to, tries to put it all together in one space, it's always a bit too much to chew. But I would say Pynchon's probably had the best crack at it so far. Even, I mean, there's a couple of things that I just don't quite like, you know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the book. There's just nothing that dragged me in like it
Hmm.
did with, I don't know. I like reading about drugs. That that didn't sound right.
Say.
I no, because like in a lot of ways, good and bad. This reminded me of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and we've spoken
Mm.
about that on the podcast before.
Yeah,
Very
you love it.
drug oriented, but that had the benefit of very first person, very intimate, and very manic. Inherent
Yes.
Vice has a lot of. It has to follow at least some formality to construct a story and a narrative that people can actually understand, and it does that well. It's good, and the film is, I think yeah, the film's great. I really like the film a lot.
Yeah.
It was such a treat going back to that. That was really nice. But
Oh,
obviously, my brain's a bit like jelly, so I can't retain information anymore. I don't have it in me.
you're
But
like a drug-free version of Doc Sportello, basically.
yes, a drug-free. Yes, yeah.
Uh, uh, I have to say I loved Inherent Vice the book in ways that I didn't expect. Kind of like you, Jack. It's a very different beast from the movie, yet it's so close to it. It's just on parallel lines, just running alongside it, and it's beautiful. I think the first thing that took me a second to adjust to it was kind of like I started reading it and I got two chapters in and I thought, wait, when was this written? Because like was it actually written in the 70s? Because it felt like it. But no, it's a contemporary novel. And that already was fascinating that this relatively, let's say, elderly author was had a very successful career writing a whole bunch of things because he wrote a lot of nonfiction essays, not only novels. He's written like 5 or 6 novels, almost like Thomas Harris. We talked about him. He's another one of those writers where it takes a long time to get around to writing something, and whenever it does, it's just a smash hit with critics and readers. And so, Inherent Vice, I started reading it, hoping that it would be kind of this intoxicating ride that would just suck me in and never let go. It actually had the opposite effect in the best way possible. I started slowly enjoying it, just sinking into the pages, reading 1 or 2 chapters a day over the span of a month. And I thought it would kind of lose some aspects of like the intrigue of the mystery. But that's when it became clear that, just as we're going to be talking about with the movie, the mystery doesn't matter that much. There's no real drive by design in the story. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about it because you hear the title Inherent Vice, and that comes back into the movie as well. Kind of like what is the inherent vice? It's kind of like, okay, something that's bound to change because of its nature in a more general way. So it's kind of like, oh, food is going to decompose and the fire is going to extinguish itself, whatever. And so, what is the inherent vice here? The inherent vice are the 60s. It's just not even just the 60s, just everything. Everything is inherent vice. Love, friends, life, work, like everything is bound to change. And at the center of these changing times, after Charles Manson and after an era of murder that's just changed America completely, you have this man who is unable to change. Doc Sportello is such a fascinating character because he is competent at being a detective, but he's not the most clever person in the room. He manages to stumble into like culprits and into resolutions to the case and other side jobs that he has in ways that never feel that are comical but never farcical. It's such an interesting line that Pynchon writes that's incredibly amusing. And yes, like what do you guys think about Doc Sportello as a character on the page at least?
I'll go. Um, Again, you can't help but kind of make note of the movie. I feel like
Mm,
this one and this I guess version of Doc is I don't know. I don't think he's like as in tune with like himself in the book as much as he is with in the movie, or as it kind of comes off in the movie. He I think he's just kind of more focused on like soaking things in rather than like expressing like how he feels about certain things. So like with the numerous cases in the book, I don't really think like he's connected to really any of them. He's just kind of like a wandering soul at points.
Yeah.
While in the movie, the driving force for Doc is Shasta, and I go back, I think of that scene when he's like writing on the board, and you see like it's like Mickey, and it's who's the other person on the other person on the board, and in the middle is Shasta, and that's like the key thing that's driving him into each and every case, because somehow she's connected, or somehow she's, you know, her story's been told through someone else involved in the case. With the book, it's kind of sad, just like how he is just there's no connection with him in the universe that he's in, and he's not like a troubling character to follow, but like as a protagonist, we really don't like get too much about. We don't learn too much about him, I feel. Although we do get some great moments in the book where like his family's involved, which I would have been really interesting. Would have been really cool if we got in the movie, but like it's like little moments like that we can kind of see like he's, you know, beyond like the hippie, you know, title that he dons. He is like kind of just like an average guy who loves his family and just wants to hang out with his friends and work. And the book, I definitely think like emphasizes like I don't know if dichotomy is the word, but a connection between him and Bigfoot, and like how stripped down, they're basically the same person. And I think we get that in a more emotional sense with the movie, but like the book definitely kind of focuses in on that too. All in all, he's just a really kind of, I really don't. I'm rambling. I feel like I'm, you know, spewing out the book, but like I don't know like really what to think of him. You know, he's like a simple protagonist, but he's also complex. Um, he's fascinating to say the least. A guy who, you know, is just kind of in the moment, but also just kind of doesn't know himself in a way. And I have a feeling like, you know, applying history, like, you know, when the transition from the hippie movement to like, you know, the 70s with Vietnam and then Reaganomics, you know, and all that, you know, the AIDS epidemic and stuff like that. I worry that like Doc would have been truly lost because he just didn't, he can't really grab onto anything and stuff like that. So, and in that sense, he's a really tragic character, I feel.
Yeah. For as fun as the book can be, there is this constant layer of melancholy throughout, but it's not, it seldom feels hopeful. That's the thing, because like you said, you know where everything is going. The characters don't know what's going to happen in history, but you do. And especially the way that's fascinating that Doc has no real like strong romantic relationship in the book, to the point that he has a lot of like very random sexual, very explicitly as well called sexual encounters with women that are fun, but yes, I don't think he would survive past like 1982 probably, which is a sad thought. But hey, you either change with the times or you die with them, I guess.
Yeah.
So how about you,
Kind of a
Ewan?
relic.
Well, I mean, it's funny you should say that, because it's like even now you have people very reminiscent and writing a lot about this period, and I think it's because the nostalgia bus is on its way. It's kind of barreling through the 80s at the moment. You think about pop culture now, and it's sort of the 80s vibe. You know, Tears for Fears and Soft Cellar everywhere. Stranger Things is doing it. It'll be the 90s soon enough, and we're still in the phase where people can sort of milk the 70s and the sort of the implications of the 60s, and it happened most of all with Forrest Gump and stuff like that, which is just a sightseeing tour through the big events of the 60s and the 70s, which is just, don't know why people like it, but for Inherent
I
Vice, it
agree.
does help that exactly. it helps Inherent Vice that it is actually a contemporary novel. It's, you know, especially in the book where you've got, you know, references to the Beach Boys and like Roman Holiday remakes and stuff. It's those are the things that can really build the world around it, and it's very difficult because Stephen King does that a lot, and in recent
Mm.
years it's not good because you're reading a horror novel and you see the Big Bang Theory mentioned. It's not quite right. You've got to use cultural references that set the tone, and you couldn't name anything better than the Beach Boys to set the tone of the 1960s and going into the 70s when Pet Sounds had released, and the drug culture behind it, and Brian Wilson. It all makes sense. It all connects correctly. And
Hmm.
I think that's what it's Pynchon is not plucking and grabbing whatever he can from the 60s thing. God, I've got to create a landscape here with, you know, contemporary references. He's actually processing it as this will build a character, this will grow a supporting character. It makes sense, and it's something I appreciate the movie does as well. It is there, it is present, it's always going to be present, but it's because people now have a nostalgia to it
Hmm.
rather than they're living through it, and it's surprising how well both manage it. I think a lot of it does come down to Doc Sportello, who in the novel feels very connected to events, feels very, you know, needs to be there. In the movie, just kind of drifts through, but quite nicely because I mean that it reflects on the mentality of the '60s in a way where people just kind of drifted through, and like you said, Nick, probably didn't make it past the 1980s. Um, but no, I think the reason Pynchon's work works so well here is that it's very free flowing. It's very happy to just sort of, you know, rein it in a bit, not accelerate or put the foot down on the pedal too hard. It's very, you know, it's just nice. It flows rightly because it's
Hmm.
not over relying on, oh look, this is a culture thing from the '60s. Look, there's the Beatles and stuff. It's like Ringo Starr isn't showing up to sing about the octopus's garden. It's actually like basing itself on a big
Missed
cornerstone.
opportunity.
I hate Ringo Starr. We'll have to do a Beatles episode so I can tell you that one.
Oh.
Um, it all stems from a school hall performance that I had to do where I played Yellow Submarine on a ukulele when I was 12. But that's by the by. Um, still remember that. We had plectrums made out of milk cartons. We But as far as Inherent Vice goes, it knows when to pull those culture punches where a
Hmm.
lot of, especially now, what I appreciate more than anything is that, you know, when you look at something that is set in the 60s or the 70s, I mean, Licorice Pizza, which was fantastic, a phenomenal movie, even that is guilty of it. You know, you've got Life on Mars playing in the background, you've got all the tanglings of the 70s culture. And what Pynchon has managed to do is obviously that was a contemporary novel. The adaptation too works on that plane. It's pulling the right punches where these are references to that time. They are good references and people will understand them, but they also make sense to the story. They're not just mentioning it for the sake of it. It actually develops the process. We know why Doc Sportello is taking lots of drugs. It's because that was the fashionable thing of the time. We know why people are moving on from it because that's what the government were doing at the time. And it all slots together really nicely because it
Mm.
is an honest reflection of that culture, that period, especially the book. It's rare that you get opportunities like that in fiction to actually reflect it properly, and I think it helps that Pynchon caught it at the right time, like just as it was coming to its ebb, just as Joan Didion was, you know, slagging the whole movement off, saying it was just a horror show.
Mm.
That's when it bursts out, and that's when Pynchon kind of hits the nail on the head, and it's really good. It's the right time for it. I think that's what really helps Inherent Vice.
Yeah, it brings it to life in such beautiful detail, and it's never obvious. That's the thing. It keeps dropping names even of older movies, and I love that he actually puts like the date of the movie and it's like
Yeah.
Roman 1955 or something like that. Comes in to ground it. It's yeah, it grounds the narrative in the time period, but it also reminds you constantly that you're reading a book, which is so endearing to me. It's this borderline meta approach to the writing, and even the way he moves from location to location. That's something that was driving me insane because it's bold. It's so bold to have, I don't know, 15 pages of just Doc and the Bigfoot Bjornson sitting down at a diner talking, And then in one page, you have Doc going to another person who tells him something that he has to go to another place. He goes there and he meets another person that tells him to go to another place. In like one page, like 2 paragraphs. It's this constant just juxtaposition because he's shifting back and forth between these styles that manages to keep the writing so engaging, so fascinating without ever tiring you out, which is a testament to Pynchon's writing, I think. And it does also translate rather nicely to the big screen. And I think it's time we move on to the Paul Thomas Anderson movie.
That was a
And
seamless transition. It's a shame I've just mentioned it.
mwah, mwah, so seamless. No, it's fine. I like it that just the name dropping of the movie here and there, but just to talk briefly about not really the production itself. What I find interesting is the way that Paul Thomas Anderson ended up making this movie, because basically it was producing it was knee deep in the production of The Master in like 2011, and he got the book Inherent Vice, he read it, and as an exercise, since he had never properly adapted anything, because I think the There Will Be Blood is loosely based on a 1920 something book, but other than that, everything else was an original script. And so he took Inherent Vice and he said, as an exercise, I'll just transform this into a script, see what happens. And he did, and this was a way to kind of unwind, a very peculiar way to unwind while working on The Master, which is just a beautiful piece of cinema. And he ended up loving what he was making so much that he refined it, he cut off some scenes, he removed certain locations, reshaped some characters, and ended up actually making Inherent Vice, which came out at the end of 2014. A movie that unfortunately wasn't too successful, but then again, I don't blame the general public for not really vibing with Inherent Vice. It's such a specific film. And just in terms of general changes, before we dive into your thoughts, the only major things are that the entire Las Vegas section of the movie is removed, so that Paul Thomas Anderson actually keeps the story grounded in Los Angeles, which I think is a great choice, honestly, because he manages to make it feel even more like this microcosm that's in it's just shifting slowly and steadily. And then the other major change, which you alluded to, Jack, is the core of the movie. Inherent Vice, the book, can be by design is meandering, and Paul Thomas Anderson understood something. He was like, I think there's something there between Shasta Fay, the woman who hires Doc Sportello, and Doc. There's something there, and I want to explore it. And he ended up, for me at least, he ended up crafting such a beautiful portrayal of love, a love that you cannot let go of, that drives you to do the weirdest things just for that little hope of maybe having it again, which again kind of ties back into the inherent vice of it all. Is this is a love that's bound to fail in some way, but Doc fights for it in his own weird way. So, Jack, what's your history with Inherent Vice? What are your thoughts on this film?
Well, so I think 2016 was the first time I ever saw this, and like I liked it, didn't really get it, couldn't really, you know, comprehend it. I think I was like 18 and freshly out of high school, brain not fully developed, still isn't. And I knew I really liked the film, and I just couldn't explain why. Mind you, the first time I actually completed it was the third attempt for me in watching it. I tried several times beforehand, or twice beforehand, and I just couldn't. Like, I was like, not in the right mood. And that third time ended up being the first time I actually completed the film. Like, it was really good. And then the second time, I watched it and just kind of remained stagnant. Really loved it. Nothing really changed for me. But last year in the summertime, I got like the itching to rewatch it, and it's because of a fellow Letterboxd user, Frank Ritz. I don't know if you follow
Mm.
him. He's one of the best people on there. His favorite movie's Inherent Vice, and he and I would talk about it every time he would upload a log, and it kind of just pushed me to rewatch it. So, you know, took, I took an edible, and as one does, and basked in the glory of Inherent Vice. And that experience was intense, to say the least. Ended up, just based off, the how my mind was at that time. I was like, faces were turning different colors and things like that, and I was like, oh my god, what's gonna happen? Even though I knew what would happen. But one thing that kind of remained, like, if anything was clear for me for that viewing, was that, like, this is more major than I thought it was. And I decided to go back to it a couple days later, just to kind of see, like, where I felt, because I was beginning to realize, or beginning to think rather, that this might be my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson movie, and I wasn't too comfortable saying that. That that subsequent viewing, just, it blew me away, and I was just impressed of how counterculture cinema is one of my favorite subgenres of film. I'm so fascinated by, like, the early 60s to, like, 75, when, like, counterculture cinema kind of turns into the paranoid thriller.
Mhm.
And that whole period just it's really interesting to me. And I felt like Inherent Vice was just was the perfect transition piece from, like, the drug movies of the 60s to, like, the paranoia kind of uncertainty of, like, 70s films. And then watched it twice, two more times after that. And after that second viewing in the summer, and just kind of continued to grow in my estimation. And then my girlfriend and I, we were doing a Paul Thomas Anderson marathon in preparation for Licorice Pizza. And so I ended up rewatching it in December. And then, yes, last night, rewatched it again. I think it's like my seventh or eighth time seeing the film.
That's
It's so
amazing.
good. I love it. It's a drug. it's there was just that period in the summer where I was just addicted to it. Like, I couldn't stop, like, thinking about it, couldn't stop watching clips, couldn't stop listening to the music, understanding, like, why he
Oh
chose
yeah.
specific songs. It's such a hypnotic experience. Um, and yeah, that's kind of the gist of my Inherent Vice journey. And I have a feeling, because of you, that I will probably end up rewatching this 7 more times in the year. Like, I got the itch at the end of it.
Nice.
I'm like, oh no, please, no, I can't. I have to watch new things. I have to whittle down my 14,000 film watch list. But Inherent Vice every other week. Yeah, I
Such
love
an
it.
addictive movie. Such an
It
addictive
really
film.
is.
How about you, Ewan? What are your thoughts on Inherent Vice?
Yeah, it's all right. No, I
And
am. Yeah, that's
Well
it.
said.
No, I think the obviously you spoke of the changes there that the film has to make, and I feel like they're necessary. You
Mm,
look at the budget for this, and it's in the 70s that would have been a lot of money, but for today's standards, it's nothing. Which is always amazing. Like, Owen Wilson, I imagine, gets paid that from just Cars alone. So, you know, to make a culture piece on that is incredible. But I will say, I think the thing I like most about Inherent Vice, and it's probably why I'm so fond of it, is it's the sense of abandonment throughout that just whittles the character away. We get to see Doc Sportello at just that lowest ebb, and I think
mm.
visualizing that, I mean, Paul Thomas Anderson does a fantastic job, like, amazing. I remember seeing one comment, or it might have been in a review, that someone said, "Why didn't they just de-age Jeff Bridges and get the Coen brothers to do it?" And it's like, well, yeah, but no, I think Joaquin Phoenix, or as I called him before we'd started this recording, speaking to Nick, the Joker Man, he just does a fabulous job, like, really, really good. I think I, I don't mean to typecast the bloke, but he has the look. He has the look of Doc Sportello. If you had named anybody else for Doc Sportello, I'd think that's not right. That
Mm.
doesn't settle well. I think he personifies it so well. It's like the shaggy sideboard, the long hair, it's a hippie infusion of, like, a culture that had gone from being a very cool hip fad to a sort of resentful period where people didn't understand it anymore and didn't like it. And that shift was so quick. It kind of shows with Bigfoot, where you've got that contrast between Bigfoot and Sportella, who are just, like you said, Jack, more or less the same person, just different paths. And it's mad to think that a couple of years before the setting of Inherent Vice, those two would have been the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Doc Sportello would have been the big hero, and Bigfoot would have been the suit that people just didn't like to see. And it's that shift in tone that I think the film gets really nice, and I think it always helps that it's kind of the cheeky getaway that films have, is that the visualization can bring a lot to the table.
Hmm.
Inherent Vice, especially, you think of the color, even the poster. You think of the color scheme, the neon effects,
Such a
the
good
bright
poster.
visuals, the real. Oh, it's beautiful. It's a capturing of that culture's image. It's that period, and it looks fantastic. It is a definitive adaptation. It's one of the few where I'm like, yeah, that you cannot get that any closer to what the book is about, to what really makes Pynchon's novel work so well, has been captured by Anderson. And like you said, he cut out a lot of stuff.
Hmm.
The goal of that, I imagine, was to just make it a bit easier to follow. The result is essentially a streamlined rendition, which works really nicely. It's simplified. It still works. It still has layers to it. It still has a lot going for it, and it still has Owen Wilson in it. So take that what you will. It's ups and downs from there, but no, it's a very, very good adaptation. It's probably one of the best adaptations I've seen of a book. It's not one of my all time favorite films, but it's, if you think of the quality of the book and then the quality of the film, they're so on par with each other. Where it's like, you know, I can't name many other books that have that same quality.
Yeah, it's hard because on this show, like this is the 12th episode. We talked about almost 20 books by now, including like the weirdest ones. We talked about the Grinch. We talked about Godfather together. Why? But those were the days back in December. But it is something that we've often like. That's kind of the goal of this is what's how do you adapt a book, especially a book like Inherent Vice? How do you make it into a movie that works and works as well as this one? And I think that's kind of the magic of Paul Thomas Anderson, that who I genuinely believe is one of the greatest American filmmakers of our time. By the time he's finished his career in like 50 years, hopefully, he's going to be one of the greatest ever, period, because he keeps putting out banger after banger, because he makes such tactile, lovely little movies where where everything works, from the camera work to the soundtrack to the casts. Like we've mentioned Joaquin Phoenix as Doc Sportello, which is excellent casting. You were talking about it, you and I was struggling. I was like, who could play this character? Like in 2015, who could have played it? It was like, I beats me. I don't know. I don't see anyone else playing him. And you have other people. You have Josh Brolin as Bigfoot Bjornson. You have Owen Wilson, Catherine Waterston, Reese Witherspoon, Benicio del Toro, Jenna Malone, Maya Rudolph, Martin Short in a scene-stealing performance. Like it's
Yeah.
an incredible cast. It's so good, and everyone works. And I think it goes back to just the changes that Paul Thomas Anderson made. He made it a focused affair. He started off like the noir that the book is kind of subverting, where it is Doc Sportello at home, Shasta Fay enters, and she's like, "Yeah, Doc, and I need your help. Just Mickey Wolfman, the guy I'm with right now, is disappeared. Can you look into it? I'm just gonna vanish for a few days. Bye." And she leaves, and you're already intrigued because you think, okay, what's their relationship? Who's Mickey Wolfman? Who's Shasta Fay? Who's Doc Sportello? And throughout the entire movie, you start to understand all of those elements, all of those things, and you get an idea of these characters, of the world they live in, of the way that it's changing for the worse. Honestly, there's relatively little light, and the few moments of light come from Doc. I think it's like one of the lines from the book and the movie as well, where it's kind of like Doc is not a do-gooder, but he's done good or something like that. Where you can see this is a man who keeps messing up his relationships with the people around him, both romantically and just in terms of friendship and work. but he tries so hard and he wants to do the right thing. And so when he has to, for instance, help a woman try to find, it was Jenna Malone, try to find her missing husband, who's Owen Wilson, that becomes a whole, again, elements that are in the book, that's part of the novel, but it's so much more emotional in the film, the way it's played out, and it's absolutely lovely. And I don't know if I would say it's my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson, but it's up there. Like if I watched this another time, I would probably consider it my favorite. And I watched it the first time around in 2016, which was my first active year on Letterboxd. I watched like 200 movies, which is nothing by by today's standards for me. But that was a lot for me back then. I was like, oh, I finished high school as well. I'm starting uni. I don't know what life has in store for me. I'm young. I was in love at that time. And so I watched this literally at the end of the year, and it was the perfect movie to just cap off 2016 and enter 2017. And I hadn't rewatched it since. Like it's been almost 6 years since I last saw it, but I remembered everything. It's such a memorable experience, and it's so ooh. And there's a lot. There's a lot in this. So
Yeah.
this just like the way that both the book and the movie talk about, for instance, race and minorities, how they are manipulated by both the media and politicians and the police force. This is a very anti establishment story where it's constantly destroying big corporations, the United States government, the LAPD that's corrupted at its core. It has all of these elements that are also kind of taken from the inspirations for Pynchon, who went back to noirs from the 40s and 50s, but they are evolved for a modern era that it manages to, and that's also part of the genius of Inherent Vice. Written in 2009, it's showing you that yes, what happened 30 plus years ago, still happening now, and we're talking about it in 2022, still happening now. Things unfortunately haven't changed. Again, actually they have changed, but only for the worse. So how do you guys feel about just the criticism of this story about capitalism and inequality in terms of like social classes, social status, and all the various characters that Doc interacts with? What do you think?
It's a good question.
It's
Very heavy.
I agree. No,
Well
you
said.
know, there is an endless list of books and films and music. Everything can criticize something, but to do it right and to do it correctly is very, very difficult. There
Mhm.
are probably only a small handful of truly great criticisms of culture of the time or of a culture past. Um, with Inherent Vice, we're very lucky that we've got both in one package. We've got a contemporary criticism and then we've got a reflective piece. Both work, both are correct in their thought process. They are well reasoned. They pull the right punches. And I think even if you were to disagree with what the film and the book were trying to say, you can at least understand and appreciate where it was coming from.
Mhm.
It's not a place of sort of hidden intent. It's a genuinely earnest belief. Um, and I think that's the greatest strength of Inherent Vice is that this is someone that truly believes what they're saying, which is hard to come by in certain films that I will not name that have come out recently. But I I think Inherent Vice, the great benefit of it is that Pynchon wrote with clarity of that time. There is no, I think there is a bit of sugarcoating, but that's because we're getting this from Doc Sportello's perspective. That is his, reasonably, that's what he thinks. He's not going to say, "Oh, what a terrible time the '60s was." No, because he lived through it and he thought it was incredible. We're not going to get that. You're not going to get that from someone that lived through it. And that's where the film comes in. The benefit of it is that we can see the sort of lethargy of it. We can see the contrast a bit more clearer now that we're 40 years removed from, is it 50 years removed from it? Oh my
Mm.
god, the '70s was ages ago.
Yeah.
I say that as if I was born in the '70s. Um,
I was a wee lad.
1999. Oh, back in the day when I was minus 27. No, you get a real sense of understanding for a period that we never lived through, and I think that's the great sort of thing about these texts is that, however critical or defensive of the times it is, at least it's accurate. At least there is a fight within it. It's really gunning for something that a lot of people at the time criticized, and a lot of people still do criticize. And I think to get that right, it's very difficult. I mean, I was going to use the Batman as an example, but that's just because it's on my mind now, and I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to. A lot of content now tries to criticize something, not because it's a focal point, but because it makes it relevant for search engines. And you never get that with Inherent Vice, because it is a genuine, like, criticism. It is a genuinely thought-provoking opportunity. It actually has feelings towards what it's criticizing. Paul Thomas Anderson, he's 50-odd. He grew up at this time. He has a connection to it. He's not just thinking, yeah, that's probably accurate. No, he knows what was going on, and Pynchon do as well, and that's the real benefit. It really does help the criticism of the... I don't know, is it the counterculture that's getting criticised, or is it the actual mainstream that's getting criticised in Inherent Vice? Because, Doc Sportello may be this lethargic beast that just inhales cannabis like it's free. But on the flip side, you've got someone that's very droll. Bigfoot is such a horrible person, really, like at the end of the day. And it's very hard to decipher who's the real disaster in that. Is it the person that's sort of bowed to the whim of the acceptable culture of the time, or the one that's still riding the coattails of one that's just died? And it's such a nice contrast, and I think that contrast is explored very well in both the book and the film. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
Bigfoot is... Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I was just going to say, you definitely make a really interesting, point with Bigfoot and Doc there, where Doc's basically on this road to death, and then Bigfoot's on this road to the future, and then neither one of them are really happy. One thing I noticed in my viewing last night, I kind of alluded to it in the last viewing I had before last night, that like Bigfoot might be one of the most, just not like tragic, because I don't want to say like I'm sympathizing with him, because I don't. He's such a problematic character.
Yes.
But you definitely get like the idea that maybe he's not too happy with his decisions in life, both in the book and especially in the movie. And not to flex on the shirt, but the scene, when he's giving his commercial, he's using hippie language, I guess is the word. And like, it's very funny, but like also because we know Bigfoot and how he's this just horrible cop who manipulates and abuses the law and bends it to his whim. But you also get the sense like he's just as lost as our main character is and will be. And the scene when he devours all the weed, you get the sense like that's like both like an urge for him to like be his true self, and also maybe I'm not going to say he wants to be like a hippie, but like the weed, the devouring of the weed probably symbolizes like that sort of like containment that he feels in riding this coattail into the 70s and 80s and onward, but also probably just alludes to the fact that he's just incredibly lonely and regrets the choices that he's made. In the book, I definitely got the vibe that like he regrets marrying his wife at certain times, just with how he like just with how he talks about her and stuff. And in the movie, the scene when he calls Doc and she's yelling at him, he's like looking up at her like, yeah, I love you so much for that right now. And
looks like a little kid.
Oh, he's like, they only pay for half of it or whatever it is, and she's like, they only pay for half of it. The therapy, but like at the end of it, you kind of just realize that even though he is so certain in what he thinks he believes, there are certain moments throughout the film that like allude to like maybe some sort of moral confusion with the things that he does, or some regret, and how ultimately like he really can't like break away from that, and he's just going to continue being this horrible, miserable piece of garbage. While Doc, at least he's like on this dying road to you know, dying road to history, he's at least like kind of enjoying himself before, and then before acknowledging like this will eventually end. So that's just really interesting. Like Bigfoot is the representation of like he is the criticism of like, you know, everything you stated, Nick, before when you gave the question, but also it's also kind of just showing that he's just as broken as everyone else in the movie and stuff. So,
Yeah,
oh, Bigfoot.
I do often feel that some people at least hate what they want to be. It's kind of like I totally agree that I can see Bigfoot kind of envying the free flowing life of Doc. Instead, he has this very like strict way of living. He has a wife, he has children, he has to be like the breadwinner in the family, and he's a cop, so he has to uphold the law. And this is wrong, and it's gonna like abuse my powers in very horrible ways
Mhm.
throughout the narrative. And what I find also very tragic, I completely agree that he's a tragic character. Like pretty much everyone, honestly, in this story, everyone is tragic to an extent. And the side of Bigfoot that's kind of more interesting in the novel, that's explored deeper, is his backstory, because what's driving and motivating let's call it his inherent vice, is the fact that he lost a partner on the job, and he still wants to like the case is called cold, but he doesn't want that to happen. He just wants to stay on the case. Who killed my partner? I want answers. Everyone else in the department now hates me. I'm working on my own. I just want to get revenge of some sorts, and that just motivates him to do everything in the story. And when reading that in the novel and then watching the movie again, it kind of complements they complement each other in that sense, because it becomes a bit kind of like you said, Jack. He's not likable per se, but you understand him. You're kind of like,
Yeah.
okay, I get where you're coming from now, Bigfoot. And I feel the same way about all the other characters. Honestly, there's always this lingering sadness in all of them. I love, for instance, the Owen Wilson character, who's just relatively forgettable, let's say, in the novel. Um, and that's probably the only criticism I would say about the movie, is that despite being like set in 1970 and everyone has the hair and the makeup for the time, they're all a bit too pretty. Because of reading the book and the way these characters are described, like Jenna Malone and Owen Wilson in the novel, they are like super like the heroin addicts, whatever, like crack addicts. Their faces just shifted and changed in horrible ways. They have a daughter that had problems at birth, and which leads to one of the funnier moments in the film where Joaquin Phoenix just screams, "Okay, nice," just incredible, incredible moment. Um, but yeah, it's like those characters are they're just trying to live, trying to adapt to the times, and the times are saying no, just constantly beating them down. Which leads me to the character of Shasta Fay, which again in the book kind of left on to the side. She just comes and goes. She's in the beginning, she's a little bit at the end, but that's it. She's not a particularly well, she's important. Like she kicks the story forward, she kickstarts the narrative, but then she's gone. Doesn't really matter that much. And in the movie, it's the opposite. Paul Thomas Anderson just loves her, and I think the casting of Catherine Waterston, who wasn't that popular before this film, I think it's brilliant. She was a revelation in this movie. And again, she's in just a few scenes, but those scenes are so good. And Paul Thomas Anderson knows how to use a song in his movies. But for me, my favorite scene in this film, probably even in his entire filmography, is the flashback to the Ouija board.
Oh,
It's so good. Just
so
this
beautiful.
scene. Oh, Shasta and Doc, they're off on drugs for one of their like very short periods where they weren't into using drugs, and they're just trying to go cold turkey, and they're suffering, and they ask a Ouija board to like, oh, where can we score drugs? And the Ouija board gives them a phone number where they're like, yeah, fellow dopers, come join us at this place. Come quickly because we have drugs for everyone. And they just rush to this random spot. who knows if it's a police trap? Doesn't matter. They just go driven by this need for drugs, and when they get there, there's literally nothing. But they just stay with one another and stop thinking about the drugs, stop thinking about anything. They're just enjoying their own company, and it's beautiful, and the music is lovely. And again, that scene is so sad because Doc, in the voiceover of Sortilege and in the writing of the book, which is the same. Again, that's we haven't talked about that, but just briefly, the book is all in third person, but the movie utilizes narration through the character of Sortilege, who's a very minor character in the book. And here she's kind of like this Greek chorus of sorts, just this ever present character that's narrating everything, which is just brilliant, brilliant way to use Pynchon's writing. Um, and in that moment, Doc is kind of thinking, like, yes, I knew things weren't going to last, but I still remember that moment in such a strong way. And it's one of the best portrayals of just a happy memory before things go to shit. It's oh, just talking about it's giving me shivers. But yes, Shasta Fay.
Oh,
How do we feel about Shasta Fay?
she's
Jack,
the
why don't you?
key.
Yeah.
She's the key to the movie. She really is. Like, while the book kind of, you know, keeps her at that very minor character who just simply kicks things off and appears, she really is, with what PTA is trying to do with this film. She really is like the key. And the whole movie, you know, I've written about the movie's use of like memory and time. Those are two of like my
Mhm.
favorite, you know, thing, like, topics in film. And she really is the embodiment of both memory and time with the movie. How she's this fleeting image in Doc's mind. You know, we'll get like cuts to her like laughing,
Mm.
and they'll cut back to Doc, or fade in, fade out. And so, oh my, do we need? Let's talk about that scene real quick when he's lighting a joint, and then it like he lays the image of her on top. You know what I'm talking about? Just
Yes.
perfection, perfection. But she she represents, you know, the fading, the past, and in terms of like the relationship, but also like you can also say like history again, you know,
Hmm.
like what has kind of progressed into now. um and she, I wouldn't say like she has total control of the screen every time she's on, you know, but her presence is felt in this. I think she's more effective when she's not on screen, when you
Mm.
get like a when you hear her name, when you maybe get a picture of her. That's where it's most effective for me, because like it, with what Anderson is doing, it's like you could say it's a breakup movie. It's about, you know, getting over your lost love, and kind of coming to terms with that like nothing is really guaranteed to remain stagnant. But also, um, where was I going? I think she's such a great character. It's so hard to talk about just because like you want to say so much with her, but like she really is the key, and she's the key to the sadness, the key to the happiness, the key to it all. She overcoming that grief and losing
Mm.
your romantic partner due to a breakup, the memories that stay in your brain while you're trying to get over that, the drug of that person that you kind of take in when you think of that memory, and it, and an attempt to kind of wean yourself off that person, you end up coming closer to them. And yeah, Shasta Fay. I could go on and ramble, but like she's one of my favorite characters, probably in all of his movies. Honestly, like she might Catherine Waterston. I don't think she was nominated for anything. She got like
Don't
no
think so.
recognition, but like, she really is like incredible in this movie. Such a captivating performance, and you know, just a captivating character from, you know, beginning to end.
Very ghostly presence. That's something that caught my eye this time around, because she never interacts
Yeah,
with anyone else. She's always in Doc's apartment pretty much in the entire movie, and it's
you actually
you
bring up.
almost doubt that she's not there in a
Yeah,
way.
that's what I was about to say. Like, I wonder if like it's just in his head.
Mm.
I wonder if like you could. I don't know if I'm on that train yet, but I wonder if like you could read um it as she never like exists. She never was in the movie to begin with, or maybe the ending she's not there. You
We'll,
know,
we'll get to the ending. We'll get to the ending. Uh,
yeah, we'll get there. But
Ewan, do you have any thoughts about Shasta Fay?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just what Jack and yourself have said there. That it all made sense. It's all clicking together in that jellified brain of mine. No, yeah, I don't think she exists in that film. The fact that she's always around Doc and in the apartment, and it just makes sense considering how little presence she has in the novel. Like
Mm.
she sets it off, she kicks things off, and away it goes. It's like you said, Jack. It's the best moments are when she's mentioned rather than seen, which is a shame because Catherine Waterston's performance is phenomenal. Um, I always thought, initially when I first watched it, it's thought, oh, that's a cop out ending. Very happy for a character who doesn't really deserve it. But then you think about it and you process it and you watch it again, and it does make sense if it's just sort of a figment of his imagination. He's cleared his conscience and he's driving off into the sunset with a happy ending for himself rather than a literal, you know, coming together between him and his ex if she ever existed.
Mm.
Um, and I think that is the big turning point for me. That ending, that was what sort of won me over the first time round. But then the second time round, it makes a bit more sense. Which it's amazing that the same ending can have such a different implication both times over, yet have the same impact on me. Such a positive one. Um, I do prefer it in the film when she's got a bit more presence because it's the lovely workaround of having to adapt such a thickly tangled text because it's the out and out of right. We're going to hit a wall here. We can divert that by mentioning Shasta. We can divert that by having a quick scene that it doesn't just give us time to simmer the information that we've just been given, but we can deliberate with these characters. We can think, all right, this is the next step. This is where it's going to go, and it all connects really well. So I don't think there's a neither of them are bad.
Hmm.
Either having enough of her to make the leading man more interesting, or not at all to for the same effect. It's very very well managed. It's surprisingly well managed.
Yeah, let's talk about the ending. Let's close things off with that, because it's basically the narrative. The way the narrative goes in both the book and the film is the same. Shasta Fay hires Doc. Doc goes in on this weird quest where he meets, tries to understand what the hell is the Golden Fang, what happened to Mickey Wolfman. Mickey Wolfman is discovered and just easily taken care of. It becomes like the key goal of center of the investigation just vanishes at one point. It gets taken by the FBI in the novel. In the book, he stays in an institution. Let's just say that. But at the end, the Golden Fang is kind of dismantled, though not really, because that's how those things go. They never fully die. The police kind of wins the day. Bigfoot Bjornsson is happy. Everyone's happy. And just basically the 60s are dead. And welcome to the 70s. That's kind of how the ending goes. And the last scene of both the movie and the novel is with Doc Sportello in his car just driving. Where is it going to? You don't know. And in the book, it's just Doc Sportello sitting there. There's traffic, cars going by. He hasn't changed one bit from the first page to the last. He's still the same old Doc Sportello. Only thing is that everything else has changed. What's going to happen to him? Who knows? And it is very bittersweet. And you're watching the movie, and Doc Sportello in the car, you don't know where he's going. It's all very dreamy, but next to him, Shasta Fay. And that simple change, just so minuscule in one way, fundamentally changes the feelings that the ending gives you. And it doesn't feel like it's trying to be, let's say, a graduate type of ending. we get to the end of the movie where it's kind of like, and they're driving off into the distance, but things are not going to go well. It feels hopeful. It feels like maybe Doc can change. Maybe he can get together with the times, or he can still maintain himself and his integrity, even with Shasta Fay, who's come back to him. I don't know. It's so beautiful because it's not so clear. You can find all sorts of things into this ending. So Jack, what does the ending make you feel? What is the ending for you?
Man,
Uh,
what is I've honestly just had a change of heart about the ending.
Ooh.
Thanks. You really put something into something just clicked live. She really. I don't think I agree with you. I don't think she existed. I'm and I feel like this is like Doc's trying to give himself that happy ending because
Mm.
everyone else in the movie has that happy ending. You know, Coy gets back with his wife and kids.
Hmm.
You know, Bigfoot is the hot shot. Um, Golden Fang, they retreat back into the shadows. Um, but Doc's kind of just left with nothing. And I think that's where the movie succeeds in humanizing him and giving him emotions is that he he spent the entire movie dreaming of this girl, wanting her, trying to regain some of that past that he just won't get. And I feel like that ending just shapes the overall tragedy of that character and him just creating a scenario of him driving down the street with the girl in tow. You know, it kind of reminds me of movies where it's like the guy and the girl, they leave town at the end, like to
Mm.
start anew. And like and in the book they reference a lot of cinema, so you definitely get the idea that PTA takes the dimensions of cinema to create such a cinematic classic ending for Doc,
Hmm.
our hero. And I think what kind of made me agree with Ewan was how that scene is shot. I was hearing you talk, Nick. It was you mentioned like dreamlike. It feels hazy. If it's nothing's really in focus except those two.
Like the
And
background is
it's
fully bright,
yep,
just full
just
white. It's
exactly. It's like consuming them. And I feel like
mm,
we're either witnessing Doc on probably he's on drugs. He's high, probably high, just kind of reimagining this, or it's like a dream. Him him kind of collecting himself because of the last chapter of the book, he definitely like recollects and like tries to not like reminisce, but he thinks about everything that's happened. And I feel like in
mm.
that scene we get that we get him kind of reevaluating that, but instead of portraying reality, he creates Shasta's image next to him, clinging onto his arm as they drive away, and that just adds to the overall tragedy of Doc as a character, of how he really will not be able to grasp anything that's coming towards him. He's kind of stuck in the past, and that meeting, the lifestyle he's chosen and the love that he has for someone who just probably doesn't love him that much anymore. And yeah, I think that ending is in his head for sure, or in some sort of you know either it's on a high or he's asleep, or maybe he's just kind of maybe he's sober or something. For he's sober and he's creating this like melancholic ending for himself, this happy ending for himself, when in reality he's just so sad. But yeah,
Wow, makes me want to rewatch the movie now all over again.
told
Ewan, how
you
about
it's
you?
it's yeah, I'm not convinced that it's actually happening.
Mm,
It's definitely like a dreamlike sequence, or he's high, or something like that. But I do think it's kind of, the effect, whether or not she's there, the effect is still very much the same for him. It's kind of a closure of the times, as well as a closure for that chapter of his life. Essentially, it ties together quite nicely. The whole end of the '60s era, but also the end of that relationship. And it's it's just it's warm, it's comforting, it's bittersweet kind of, in a way that's it relies so often on that relationship between Doc and Shasta, but it, it never feels like that's the real reason that scene's in there. It's never, oh yeah, that's the culmination of their relationship. No, that's the culmination of a generation. That's it. That's the, after all the, commas and semicolons, that's the full stop. That's it. That's done. Um, and it works really well. I really like the implication of it. It's open to interpretation, but the essential shared opinion here is probably the correct one. I don't mean to toot our trumpets too highly, but we're probably correct. It's a very nice ending, and it's a nice bow to sort of wrap it all up with, because it's they've taken a crack at a big part of culture. They've done it well. Just tie it up. Just tie it up. Leave it to interpretation. That's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, not that you both were talking about that. I just started thinking about just Paul Thomas Anderson endings in general, and they're always kind of like this in a way. I didn't really connect because it's kind of like, yeah, he does kind of leave you with this deceptively optimistic ending, where it's you think of like Boogie Nights, where everything's great again, everyone's getting the dream they want, and Dirk Dickler is back doing porn. Yes, everything's gonna go great, of course. Ah, I I think that's kind of the beauty of cinema in its own way, because life doesn't have life has only one ending, and it's very late, hopefully for everyone. But in the movies, you choose where you can end the story, and everything that happens afterwards doesn't matter. And not that I'm saying this, I think I can kind of see that being kind of the ending of Inherent Vice in its own way. It's kind of like that's what happens afterwards, like 70s, 80s, doesn't matter. For Doc Sportello, what matters is that moment. Is she there? Isn't she there? Doesn't matter. He's happy. He's smiling, and he's at peace with himself. Wow.
You
Yeah,
actually,
I need to rewatch this.
yeah.
I'm feeling
If
the
I'm
need.
going, if I'm going to say like a movie of his with that has a very similar ending, I don't want to spoil it since it's new, but Licorice Pizza and I think this have a very similar kind of ending.
Hmm.
For those, I don't want to say it just in case anyone who listening
I
hasn't
haven't
seen it.
seen
If you
it
haven't,
yet.
no,
It's
Nick,
it's
go
coming
see
out
it.
next week. It's coming out
Oh,
next week.
okay.
It's
I
taking a
won't say,
while.
but I I can't wait. I can't wait for the review. I can't wait for the take.
Yeah.
But definitely got definitely similar kind of thing there. And I can't wait to hear what you maybe think of that statement once you see the movie.
I will definitely
And
talk about it.
yes, 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 yes. But OPTA.
Oh, bless him.
Oh,
Bless him.
yes.
Oh,
Bless
well.
that guy.
Anyway, just to close things off, ultimately, Inherent Vice, which version do you prefer? The movie or the book? Jack, why don't you begin? Why don't you
The
start?
movie. The movie.
Movie. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it just it hits my what I look for in film. Time, memory, lost love, counterculture cinema, and it's just a more emotional and human experience than the
Mm,
book, which is also, don't get me wrong, the book is incredible, but I gotta go with the movie.
yeah. Ewan, how about you?
Yeah, the movie. It's not very fair though, because one of the greatest directors, both living and dead, is directing it. So the odds are stacked in favor of the film. But I think that the flow of the film, the dynamic it presents, and the fact that it changes so much yet not at all. It changes so many of the set pieces and the key themes, yet
Mm,
still comes to the same conclusion, to the same openness and to the same criticism and support of the 60s culture, which is impressive considering it turns from contemporary to reflective. It's magnificent. It's fantastic. So is the book, but not as much as the film.
Yeah, I don't see myself rereading the book anytime soon. Not because I didn't enjoy it, because I had a hell of a time with it. But it's so much more of a hangout story. Let's kind of say, where you're just following these various characters that Doc interacts with. That it comes up to a certain point where it's a bit much. So I enjoyed reading it through an extended period of time. I don't know if I would have. I don't know how I would have vibed with it if I had to like read it in a week or something like that. But definitely,
That's what I
I do.
did.
Jeez. Heads off, man. Heads off. Uh, I do wonder what the. Yeah, I don't know. I agree. I agree. The movie is so good. It's so good. And just honestly, this conversation probably made me realize that it might be my favorite Paul Thomas Anderson.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. It's honestly incredible. And if you're listening to this episode and you watched Inherent Vice and you didn't like it, just this I hope we our discussion has made you want to rewatch it. And I have to say, just going through all of the letterbox reviews of people that I know, just everyone ends up loving this
Yeah.
after the second viewing, because the first time is always like 3 stars, 3.5, it's hard to follow, blah blah blah. Then the second time, 5 stars, like, oh man, the vibes, the emotions I'm feeling here. Maybe they
Yep.
were on shrooms. With again, if it's that it worked for you, Jack, the first time around, so it's one way to enjoy it. And honestly, I love this film, and I'm so happy we've talked about this. So why don't we go around the table and everyone give us your if there's anything you're doing to this moment, or if you want to share your social media. Jack, why don't you start? Where can
Uh,
the lovely listeners find you online?
First of all, Letterbox. That's where I spend most of my
Yeah.
time. Follow me. Uh, what is my thing on Letterbox? I'm not sure. Let me look that up. But you can also follow me on Twitter at CacJeating27. I post really bad jokes and movie reviews. You can. I think
I
my
think it's J.R.
Letterbox.
Keating. Yeah.
J.R. Keating. You can follow me on Letterbox. J.R. Keating. If you want to add me on Facebook, go for it.
Honestly, yes, everyone should follow you, because I follow a lot of people, but I'm always looking forward to what you write, because
You're
it's
so kind.
it's reviews that make me want to rewatch the movie, even movies that I don't like. I'm like, shit, now I have to watch it again. Now I'm just feeling the urge now. It's honestly, yes.
That means a lot. Especially, you are definitely one of my favorites. We've been through
Oh.
that. You know it. And hearing you say that, just definitely warms my heart. And
Oh man.
yeah,
How about you, Ewan? Where can the listeners find you? I know you love this bit. You love it.
I hate this bit. Get me on Letterboxd and Twitter at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. Not Evan, as a lot of people have called me. Not Ethan, as my teacher of 7 years called me at secondary school. There's no TH. There's no V. It's W, right?
Ethan Gleadow.
You can get me writing and stuff. You can get me words and things on Clapper, Cult Following, Geek Show, Newcastle World, Daily Star, any volume, Narc Magazine. There we go. That'll do. That'll do for this week's roundup.
You can. It's amazing, man. Honestly, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Nickira97. There you can find my linktree/enjoy the movies, which is links to my short films on YouTube and Vimeo, as well as my letterbox reviews, all of my articles on Clapper, all that fun stuff. You can follow the show on Twitter at Death Adaptation and on Instagram at Death by Adaptation Pod. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us. Thank you, Jack, for joining us for this special episode.
thank you for having me.
Be sure to check back in with us in 2 weeks' time, because we're doing an Easter special where we're talking about the last temptation of Christ and the passion of the Christ. It's a double whammy. I'm reading the book now of the last temptation of Christ. Spoilers, it's incredible. I'm loving it. It's so good.
It's not, as I had first assumed, a read of the Bible. It is an actual novel.
It's a novel. It's a proper novel from the 50s.
I'll have to order a copy. I'll get to it. I'll have to, obviously, in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil the episode, but it's going to be a positive one. But again, thank you so much for watching and for listening.
Brilliant.
If you're on YouTube,
The
you are
last
watching to
hurdle.
this. You're watching the visual podcast. But
Yes, yeah.
again, thank you oh so much, and we hope to see you soon again. Bye bye.